The United States is preparing what it calls an unprecedented campaign of economic isolation against Iran. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says Washington will unveil new measures next week, while maintaining its naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. The message from Washington is clear. Even as military escalation slows, the economic war against Tehran is about to intensify. And this time, the US says the pressure will be unlike anything Iran has faced before. Bessent says the new strategy will combine sweeping economic measures with continued pressure on Iran's ports. In an interview with Newsmax, he warned that Washington would introduce measures designed to create an unprecedented level of economic isolation. At the same time, the US says its naval forces can maintain the blockade indefinitely, despite growing concerns over energy supplies and tensions across the region. At the center of the confrontation is the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important energy choke points. Roughly 1/5 of global oil and gas shipments normally pass through the waterway, but traffic has collapsed during the conflict, with Iran restricting passage and attacking vessels that ignore its warnings. The prolonged disruption has sent energy markets into uncertainty and kept the strait at the center of the US-Iran confrontation. Iran is already facing enormous economic strain. The war has damaged industrial capacity, while the US blockade has sharply restricted crude exports. Tehran's economy was already weakened by years of sanctions, and the latest pressure is making the situation even more difficult. Yet previous sanctions have failed to force Iran to abandon its nuclear ambitions or surrender control over the strait. The economic offensive also reflects a shift in Donald Trump's approach. After repeatedly threatening a major military escalation, Trump has recently adopted a more restrained tone, saying Washington is low-keying it and watching Iran's worsening economic situation. Concerns over US munition stocks, the political cost of the war, and rising fuel prices have all added pressure on the administration to find another way to force Tehran to compromise. The timing is politically sensitive for Trump. With US midterm elections approaching in November, higher fuel prices and an unpopular conflict could become a growing domestic problem. Trump has claimed the United States has total control over the strait, but Iran strongly rejects that claim. Tehran says Hormuz will remain closed until Washington lifts sanctions and releases frozen Iranian assets. And Washington is showing little sign of backing down. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the US military can sustain the blockade indefinitely by rotating naval forces. With the earlier deal to end the war now collapsed and negotiations deadlocked, both sides are using Hormuz as leverage. The question now is whether unprecedented economic pressure can force Iran back to the negotiating table, or whether it will push the confrontation into an even longer crisis.
Iran just called out Washington in the most cutting way it could think of, not as an enemy, but as an addict. It started with the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent boasting that sanctions were suffocating Iran's economy. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson, Esmail Baqai, wasn't going to let that line go unanswered. He fired back on social media, calling the comment less a policy win and more a confession. His argument, whenever Washington can't make diplomacy work, it falls back on sanctions. And when those sanctions don't work either, the US doesn't rethink the approach, it just doubles down. Baqai didn't hold back on the framing. He said this isn't policy anymore, it's habit. And more than that, he called it an addiction that's replaced actual strategic thinking. He added that Iran has weathered this approach for decades and won't be pressured by what he called exhausted tactics. Then came the sharper jab. Bakai suggested it's American officials, not Iran, who are boxing themselves in, clinging to a failing habit instead of taking what could be a less humiliating way out of a crisis Washington created for itself. This isn't new rhetoric either. Iranian officials have used almost this exact addiction framing before, years ago under a different foreign minister, making nearly the same argument about US sanctions policy. Which raises the real question here. Is this really about Bessent's comment? Or is Iran using it as an opening to reset the narrative around ongoing sanctions and diplomacy? Because this exchange isn't happening in a vacuum. It comes as the US continues leaning on unilateral sanctions, even after previous rounds failed to produce the political concessions Washington wanted from Tehran. So while the insults fly on social media, the actual sanctions stay firmly in place. And so does the standoff underneath them. Words won't move this needle. The real test is still what happens at the negotiating table, if either side is even willing to sit down at one.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to Mirror Now.